Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Greetings, super friends, and welcome to today's show. You guys, today we are going to talk about drugs, or rather medicines, but not the drugs and medicines that you're probably thinking of. In fact, we're going to be talking about ancient psychedelic medicines used for hundreds or even thousands of years by indigenous societies for spiritual exploration. Now, you may have heard of some of these substances, things like ayahuasca or psilocybin or MDMA. What you may not have heard is just how powerful these things can be for personal growth, psychological development, and so much more. Now, on that note, we are joined today by Dr. Dan Engel. He's a board-certified expert in psychiatry and neurology with a clinical practice in holistic medicine, orthomolecular psychiatry, and integrative spirituality. A very, very qualified expert who has some very, very interesting opinions about these medicines. Now, on top of all this, he's the medical consultant to the Temple of the Way of the Light Ayahuasca Center in Peru and of Onnit Labs in Austin, Texas. He's also the medical director of Crossroads Ibogaine Recovery Center in Rosarito, Mexico, and the Rejuvenation and Performance Institute in Sedona, Arizona. With so many credentials, we were just absolutely tickled that he had an hour to spend with us. Now, throughout this episode, you guys, my objective was to learn more about the power of tribal medicines such as ayahuasca and ibogaine, and to learn how they affect the body. I wanted to see why it is that they're experiencing such a renaissance in the last 5 years. But, you know, as always happens, I got so much more out of this conversation that I could have possibly imagined. We went really deep into the world of psychedelics, spiritual exploration, trauma recovery, and much more. We, on one hand, geek out on the neuroscience, and on the other hand, share incredible stories. It's a little bit of an unstructured conversation, but it's easily one of the most fascinating and engaging that we've ever had on the show. Now, by the way, you guys will notice that there are no ads in this episode. Instead, I really wanted to connect with you guys a bit, share something that I personally feel is important, albeit controversial for people to learn about. And throughout the episode, I even open up about some things that I've never talked about publicly. I really hope that this episode touches your lives, inspires you, and maybe challenges your thinking. And if it does, I would really appreciate if you guys drop me a quick tweet or a review letting me know. Now, just a quick disclaimer, guys. As always, the Becoming Superhuman podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing in this week's episode should be considered medical advice or any condonement for illegal substances of any kind. Basically, be safe out there, people. And without any further ado, I'm very excited to present to you Dr. Dan Engel. Dr. Dan, welcome to the show, my friend. I'm so glad that we finally get a chance to speak. You know, I heard you speak on Tim's show, and I just absolutely love what you had to say. I'm so excited to share your wisdom with our audience. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. It's good to be on with you.
Absolutely. So like I said, I was completely blown away by what you had to say on Tim's show. It was a deciding factor for me in kind of my own journey, my own self-experimentation. But I really wondered along the way, you didn't give too much biographical details in that interview. So I wanted to know about yourself and how it is that you originally became interested, you know, in the power of these tribal medicines. I imagine it's not something that came up in med school.
You are quite accurate about that. Yeah, my background's in psychiatry. Then I got into more integrative approach after my training because I just wasn't satisfied with really how we were practicing psychiatry through the standard care. And about 3-4 years into my clinical experience with that, I was introduced to ayahuasca and experienced personally what I would say the equivalent of 10 years of good psychotherapy would have gotten to. Yeah. And a lot of people will make that same kind of equation when the ceremony's held in a really good way and you come fully prepared. And there's a lot of grace and a lot of other factors that go into play. The ability to see the deep pre-verbal, emotional, and energetic experiences that make us who we are and how we see life come to the surface. And it's really hard to get to that kind of material using standard psychotherapeutic means and approaches. And that doesn't mean that what you would have gained in personal development over 10 years happens in one weekend, because it's still our opportunity to quote unquote do the work. Mm-hmm. But that material that would be so challenging to get to just using talk means is much more available in that arena, because all that subconscious material just comes right onto the screen.
Wow. So you had really a Terence McKenna moment where you go, wait a minute,
boom.
There might be a better way to get to this stuff.
Totally. That was me taking the red pill.
Wow.
Waking up and deciding to really commit my life and my time, energy, resources, intellectual curiosity, etc., into the investigation and the exploration. So after that, fairly short order, I closed up my clinic.
Wow.
And actually lived in an ashram for about 2 years before I moved down to the jungle, and lived in the jungle for a little over a year, just to continue to unpack everything that I had experienced in that one ceremony. I dropped in and out of a couple of other arenas to experience ayahuasca before moving down to the jungle. And the strong call was just greater and greater over time. And there's no better way, in my opinion, than going straight to the source when you're really desiring to, sit at the foot of the master, which with the plant medicines is sitting right where they come from and in the arena that they're cultivated. Mm. And these are medicines that have been held in tradition for centuries, if not longer. And there is a very clear technology in interfacing with the medicines, and a very clear lineage of mastery in knowing how to facilitate that kind of ceremonial experience. So I was really curious to see, wow. First of all, I was kind of pissed off at the entire field of psychiatry for never mentioning anything relevant towards these kinds of medicines, because the charge of psychiatry in its inception is to be a spokesperson and a facilitator of soul-level psychic healing. Mm. So our role as psychiatrists is to understand what it means to have a soulful life and how to help people get really right with their minds, their hearts, and their experiences with purpose and passion coming into their most full self. And I don't know of a better modality for that cause in our day and age for the Western mind than the psychedelic medicines when held in a good way to help us get right with ourselves.
Wow. Now that's a really good jumping off point right there, because I'm sure there's someone in the audience who hasn't heard about ayahuasca, or maybe they've heard of it, they don't know exactly what it is. So can you touch a little bit on what exactly is this stuff and what is it used for originally? I mean, we've talked about spiritual awakening a little bit and knowledge of self, but what is it traditionally used for, in what context?
Great question. Ayahuasca is the combination of two different plants, and it's really the only visionary plant medicine that is a combination of two separate plants into one mixture. One is a vine and one is a leaf. And the way it works is that the vine itself has an enzyme inhibitor that blocks the degradation of the DMT in the leaf that promotes the visionary experience. Now, the vine is called ayahuasca. The leaf is called chacruna. And there's a reason that the mixture is called the name of the vine and not the leaf, because many people believe that the vine is actually doing the deeper healing work while the leaf offers the visionary experience. Now, we tend to, because of the way we live in our day and age, our minds work so fast. We're in these 30-second informational bits of data before we move on to the next thing. It's so fast, and we're looking for the next biggest, greatest, more grand thing. I was just watching this preview for Tarzan the other day, and the new Tarzan movie is even just so off the chart intense, and everything's just so intense and so intense. So we tend to get kind of drawn in the Western mind to the visionary experience, but it's quite likely that the actual healing for the body and the neurochemistry is coming from the vine. The vine has an MAOI. It's actually an MAOB inhibitor. So what happens is it slows the degradation of the neurotransmitters in the brain. And so there's a recuperative and rehabilitative experience that happens particularly with the serotonin receptors. And that seems to be part of the potential reason why people are able to go through an ayahuasca experience and actually have a significant healing from treatment-resistant depression that they may have been experiencing for years and even decades.
Wow.
It's part of the healing of the underlying trauma, the getting right with that, having a corrective experience, and some type of rehabilitative potential experience with the serotonin receptors. We still don't know necessarily what is happening neurochemically with ayahuasca, but you could make the same argument that we don't fully understand how, in fact, the antidepressants work.
Right.
Even though we have so much, 60 years plus fairly intensive scientific research looking at how antidepressants work, and we're still not totally sure how that happens. So looking at it more from a traditional standpoint, that's the nature of how ayahuasca comes into its efficacy, combining both of those plants. It's been traditionally used by native cultures in the Amazon River Basin that spans between Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador for generations and hundreds of years. There's not really an oral written tradition or history of exactly when it was found, exactly where it was found, but fairly quickly, in the timeline of things, it started to become more and more widely appreciated and utilized through a lot of the tribes in those areas. And it has been used for everything from healing physical ailments to ailments of the heart, of the mind, and of the spirit. And it's described as a visionary plant medicine that has its own spiritual essence that, from many perspectives and personal experiences, people have direct contact with the essence and the spirit of the medicine in the ceremony.
Wow.
And so this isn't something that the facilitator or the curandero or the curandera is an intermediary for. They're actually ideally creating the space that the medicine itself is the one doing the direct healing. Now, when necessary, if there's a potential block or a choque or some kind of energetic challenge for the medicine to drop in more directly with, then the facilitator can open up that blockage and allow the medicine to work more effectively, deeply, and powerfully. Now, that comes with a lot of tradition, a lot of training, and part of my concern in the plant medicines is that you have a lot of people pouring medicine without a whole lot of experience. Mm-hmm. Somebody will have a really deeply powerful healing experience of their own down in the jungle, and they get quote unquote called to start carrying this medicine. And so they come back to the States, or they go, and ayahuasca is being used worldwide. They'll go anywhere, wherever they're from, and oftentimes out of a good nature and an altruistic intention to be of service, start pouring the medicine. But that's like getting surgery done from a fourth-year medical student.
Right.
It's somebody that kind of has been studying, they kind of know what they're doing, but they don't really have a whole lot of experience. And so it's important to have a broad-based discussion around how to, effectively vet, so to speak, some of the facilitators that might not be doing the best level work, and at worst, because of negligence, might be doing something really harmful to people.
Right. I mean, I've seen firsthand people who've been completely transformed for the better with this drug. And I imagine or medicine rather, I imagine that there's the great potential to be transformed for the worse for some very serious psychological trauma.
Yeah, there is. And the medicines are really, particularly ayahuasca, are really powerful. And usually if you just get out of the way, if you hold a safe space and you get out of the way, the medicine's going to do the work.
Wow.
And the vast majority of the time, that's what happens. Mm-hmm. But it's the rare instance where people are working out of either supreme negligence or just stupidity, or even potentially out of their own greed or their own use of misdirected power, and things go wrong because they're not holding it in a really integrous field. Usually that's happening down in the jungle. This is where you hear of facilitators using black magic or just taking people's money and something egregious happening. Very seldom. I actually never even heard of something that egregious happening here in the States.
Oh, wow.
And so, the jungle, I kind of equate the jungle to like going to the ghetto. You don't know who's got your back and who's really trying to help you, or who's just going to take your wallet and leave you for dead and not really give a shit. And so it's important to just recognize that as a potential. So I'm a supreme believer of anybody that's going into the medicine arena. Make sure they know who they're sitting with, or that person's been vetted by other people. Make sure that you know that person's experience level, how long they've been working with the medicines, where they come from, where their tradition and their lineage comes from. Get a sense of their integrity, their energy, and do they know how to work as a spiritual EMT? Like if the house starts burning down, do they know the exit strategies?
Wow.
If they need to pull the ripcord, do they know where it's located? How do they arrest a situation if things get really out of hand? And I've seen things in ceremony get really out of hand because either the person going through the journey wasn't truthful, like they have been maybe doing like LSD the night before.
Oh, God.
And I actually saw that happen. That was a crazy shitstorm that went down because that person, that's a huge energetic block right there and conflict. So that was because the person going into ceremony wasn't truthful. Same thing could be said if somebody's on psychiatric medications and they didn't disclose that. That's a recipe for a really bad scenario. The other thing could happen is when the energy in the room just gets so big that the facilitator can't control it. And then things really get out of hand. So there's a lot of just different things to take into consideration, into context. And a lot of people that are just curious and they're desiring personal growth and they've heard a lot about it and they want to have an experience, they might go in blind or naive without doing that level of due diligence. So I just really wanted to lay that foundation.
Yeah, and I appreciate that caveat, for anyone in the audience, because it's very important to note this stuff. It's kind of the whole set and setting. And I've had friends who've told me, ayahuasca changed their lives. And I've had friends who told me they wouldn't wish it on their worst enemies and everything in between. You mentioned, by the way, LSD. So I'm wondering if you could kind of compare ayahuasca to both LSD and psilocybin or magic mushrooms.
Sure. We could talk a lot about the different energetic profiles and healing experiences. But for the simplicity's sake and the way my brain works is I'm pretty visual and I like maps. So I tend to think of things in relationship with others and how you would look at them in like a map. And so if we were to look at a pyramid and kind of an escalating profile of the medicine space. So if somebody's, for example, asking me, and I get this question a lot, like, never done any medicine, I'm kind of curious, where do you think I should start? First of all, I want to know, like, okay, what's your level of personal development work? Do you have any experience with meditation? Have you ever gone into a float tank? And if you haven't, start there first. Because flotation therapy is just such a great way for that subconscious material to come onto the screen. And if people can't hold their stuff together in a float tank, they're really not going to be able to hold their stuff together in a ceremony. I mean, that's a generalization, but floating is always a good starting point. And then from there, you go into like the level 1 medicine experiences. And then there's a level 2 and a level 3. So the level 1 experiences, that would be something like psilocybin. It tends to be very gentle. It's an easy entry point, low risk threshold. If you do a Terrence McKenna heroic dose, it could get a little rocky. If you just took a fistful, like 5-gram dose, that might get a little hairy,
right?
Especially if you've never done anything before. So newbies ideally are with a trained facilitator or at minimum with a safe sitter that's going to be able to help them, contain the experience should it really get out of hand.
Right.
That doesn't happen very often because ideally people wouldn't go to that dose or experience like right away. LSD is kind of a curious one.
It is.
Because Mostly in my experience because it's synthetic. And if you take too much, it will push you through a glass ceiling that you might not fully come back from.
Or want to go through. Yes.
Right. Just a little bit of a self-disclosure. I did a 10-hit journey once.
Oh, wow.
Because I was kind of curious about what that threshold was.
What, can you quantify that for me in micrograms?
Yeah, that's 1,000 micrograms.
Oh, wow. And for our listener at home, a good sized dose is 100, 150 micrograms.
Yeah. And, ultimately you can only help support people as far as you've gone. And so it was really clear to me, people were asking me about bad trips and bad journeys and hellacious experiences. And I'm like, well, I've never done like a huge LSD journey. And even though, through several hundred ayahuasca experiences working with San Pedro, Ibogaine and Iboga and Psilocybin and like going down the rabbit hole pretty far, there was still something that happened through that LSD journey that was completely out of my control. Yeah. And there was also somebody that had an experience at a similar dose range that went from essentially very sane to very psychotic fairly immediately. And it was a really clear reflection for me, like with the synthetics, you don't have the normal safeguards in there, so to speak. Like if you take too much Aya, peyote, San Pedro, Iboga, Psilocybin, if you take too much of those, you typically either puke it out, poop it out, sweat it out, and reconstitute on the other side. Usually there's like a toxic threshold that your body can't handle, so it gets it out, and it's usually no harm, no foul. Mm-hmm. That being said, there are contraindications to the psychedelic medicines, and let's just make a little disclaimer there before going any further. People with a significant psychiatric history of psychosis, mania, depersonalization, or dissociation, psychedelics are a no-go. Yeah. Just to be on the safe side.
Stay away. People who are very balanced and very sane, I'll give a disclosure as well. I've had experiences where I come away and ask myself if I'm ever going to be kind of right again, for better or worse. And nowhere near the heroic doses you're talking about.
The other reason I'm bringing that up is definitely not that I'm wearing that as any kind of badge of honor. In fact, you could make a fair argument that was fairly stupid to do. But for me, I've done a fair bit of training to get to that level of willingness to go that far. If somebody did that without a life raft or something to hold on to or an ability to send to your mind, then particularly with something like LSD, if you do too much, it can really fracture the psyche.
Oh, yeah.
And it can really create more trauma. And that's actually the opposite of what we're looking to do. We're actually looking through these experiences, heal trauma, to get to know more of ourselves, to get to know more of the world, the universe, our relationship to it, how we choose to play this human game. Because essentially that's what this whole thing is.
That's what I realized as well on psychedelic experiences, that we're really playing a game designed for our enjoyment.
Right. And it is our opportunity to show up and through our free will choice, actually choose how we want to play the game.
Absolutely.
There's this great quote by Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he says in that book, and that, by the way, I mean, that's such a seminal book and such an amazing thing for him to write in 9 days after getting out of the concentration camp. And he says, the last of the great human freedoms is our ability to choose our own attitude in any given circumstance.
Yep.
So it's that same kind of thing that you're talking about, playing the game. And, some people are born into, for whatever reason, and you can get spiritual, philosophical about that, for whatever reason, born into certain experiences and, born into war zones versus born into a rich family with kind of like all your needs taken care of pretty freely and easily. So even in different experiences, we have the opportunity in our free will how to choose that engagement. Now, if we have the experiences coming in between like birth and 5, where 85% of our personality is actually made up, if we have those experiences be the flavor of trauma and rejection and abandonment and more of the horror side of the spectrum, then it's at times really difficult to just put on a good face and choose to be happy until that stuff is understood and looked at and investigated and held in reverence and deep willingness to be with that pain, to be able to heal it and then resolve it, release it, and then more freely now be able to choose how we desire to play the game. Wow. So that's what the medicines do, is that they help us get into that pre-verbal material and get really close to it. And there's oftentimes in the psychedelic medicine experience, there's a witness ego observation platform, so to speak, that you get to in some of these experiences where you get to see the experience, you get to see yourself, everybody involved in whatever that experience was, to heal it, to get right with it, to forgive everybody involved, including yourself, and to integrate it into a new self, as opposed to ignoring it, rejecting it, acting like it's not there, or trying to get over it and not appreciating it for how it has significantly made one engage life in a particular arena. Usually, and this is kind of a summary statement for many of the seminal teachers in our current day and age, they would say that, myself included, although I didn't put myself in that same kind of role as a seminal teacher, that oftentimes our greatest challenges are our greatest teachers. Right? So if we're able to recognize challenges that have been present throughout our life, including that significant pre-verbal arena between birth and, say, 4 or 5, now we can get more closely connected to that experience as a teacher, understand how it shaped our life, and then fully forgive that experience if there is any held resentment or anger or shame or guilt. Fully get right with it, and then be more liberated to actually choose how we want to play the game.
Absolutely. We're so on the same page, Dr. Dan. It blows my mind. I wanted to touch back on the pyramid, though, that you mentioned, just to finish that off.
Great.
Ibogaine and ayahuasca, where do they fall on this pyramid?
Yeah, I put Aya in a level 2 and Iboga or Ibogaine in a level 3.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So like level 1 is like MDMA, psilocybin, low dose LSD. LSD goes in all 3.
Yes, it does.
Totally, right? Because at an entry level dose, you're going to have a soft experience. And there's thousands of case reports of people having great psychedelic assisted psychotherapeutic response using LSD in the right set and the setting, in the right dose, and with the right facilitation. There were thousands of case studies in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s before it went to Schedule 1 of great healing with LSD. So I put it in all 3. Just really have to know where you're at. Like if you're dropping, 300 mics at Burning Man, you could really blow your lid off because it's already such a charged environment.
Oh, yeah.
But if you're using 100 micrograms with a facilitator that knows trauma work, that can hold the space really well, that can help the personal investigation of anything behind the curtain, so to speak, that is a very different experience. And that can be a supremely healing environment.
Absolutely.
You have level 1. MDMA is also synthetic, but it tends to be so heart opening. It's usually a softer experience. If you took a lot, because it's an amphetamine derivative, it can get a little jittery, but it's usually on the softer arena. Ayahuasca, San Pedro cactus, peyote, I put in level 2. And the reason I put them there is because each of those comes from such a long lineage of deep ceremonial work that they deserve their due respect through that ceremonial work and through that tradition. And they do require excellence in the facilitation.
Yeah.
Now, each of them is very different. San Pedro and peyote are both mescaline-based in their primary alkaloids, so there's a similarity there. Peyote comes from North American, San Pedro or huachuma comes from a South American cactus, but they're really similar in their alkaloid profile. The feeling state of them can kind of be similar too. I know that there are many people facilitating San Pedro ceremonies without a whole lot of experience, and San Pedro generally is on the milder side. It tends to be heart opening. It's a little bit like a combination of marijuana, MDMA, and mushrooms together in a bit of a softer, gentler arena. Ayahuasca can be a little on the stronger side, a little harsher, particularly kind of like the tough love. And ayahuasca is described as a feminine spirit medicine and can play all three of those energetic profiles between like maiden, mother, and crone. And so there can be kind of a seductive experience with ayahuasca because in many ways it is a really blissful state. You get super grand visions, very visionary experience, particularly if there's a fair bit of the leaf material in there. And for some people, there's such a desire to connect to spirit. I think we all have that. There's such a desire to connect to the grandeur of life and the universe. And the medicines can help be a doorway into that experience. And some people get stuck in the doorway and they get stuck going back to the medicine because they're not finding that experience in any other aspect of their life. Whereas traditionally these medicines, one curandero described it as the medicines are like the corkscrew that unlock the cork from your bottle or your crown back to source. And once you take the cork out of the bottle, you don't need to keep coming back, to the screwdriver or whatever that thing is that pops wine corks out. And so why keep coming back? And so that just speaks to the importance of integration. Wow. And so many people are going through these experiences with not having the full integration or not even really appreciating what the integration process is, why it's important, what it includes, how to do it well, how to know that you've integrated before you go back into ceremony. And if we as Westerners typically do, if we identify something from nature that we want, we tend to use it up until it's gone. And unfortunately, that's happening with many of the medicines. They're not being used in sustainable ways. So Iboga, 95% of the Iboga that's come from the Gabon people in West Africa is gone because we started using it up without thinking about sustainability and replanting. A lot of the old ayahuasca vine is being used up. A lot of the big San Pedro cactus is being used up. Peyote is threatened in its availability because it's being used up. So if we're not thinking about the sustainability piece, then we're not doing our due diligence. If we're not offering reciprocity to the tribes and the traditions and the cultures where the medicines are coming from, we're not paying it back or paying it forward. Absolutely. So there's a lot of different things to think about. And first and foremost, if we're not integrating our own experience fully, then we're going to have the desire to keep coming back to the medicine and therefore contribute to the unsustainability of it.
Interesting. So I actually did want to ask you, imagine a future where things like LSD or psilocybin or ayahuasca are legal and they're controlled like alcohol or tobacco. In that kind of scenario, what would be kind of the safe and recommended frequency and dosage for using these substances? Are some of them something, that you would want to do periodically and some are like the corkscrew? Or are they all kind of like my experience with LSD, like, I get it. It's not getting any better. It's getting a lot worse every time kind of situation?
Great question. So let's assume that in the future, everything will be legal because I do believe we're going to be moving in that direction. I can't say when, but it just makes sense that we would. And you could argue it from a bunch of different platforms. You could argue it from the legal platform and take the case of Portugal when 15 years they decriminalized everything because their war on drugs wasn't working and 1% of their population was addicted to heroin.
Right.
And it's close to a 1% population addiction to opiates in our society and country right now as well. The war on drugs does not work. It hasn't worked. It's been putting a lot of people in federal prison. federal prison is a corporate system that significantly costs a massive amount of money to the taxpayers.
Yep.
So if the war on drugs is not working, it's costing money, and it's not potentially offering the available treatments for many of the areas that psychiatry is fairly weak at,
right,
then I think you're going to just find out eventually that it makes sense to do something like decriminalization. I don't know that it's, and this is where some people disagree with me, but I don't know that it makes sense to decriminalize everything fully across the board.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is some due diligence there. For example, Iboga is one of those things that people do die from. And so what's Iboga? Iboga is the plant. Ibogaine is the primary alkaloid. And that's the only one I would put consistently in like level 3.
Wow.
Because Iboga and Ibogaine are so strong, and there's a potential danger there. The biggest danger is if somebody has a heart condition, because it does affect the heart rate. It typically causes what's called bradycardia, or lowered heart rate. And that can get so low that you get an arrhythmia. And if you have a heart condition, or even if you don't have a heart condition, but particularly if you do and you're predisposed to it, then that can cause a heart attack and you can die. But you wouldn't know that looking from the outside, because it just looks like somebody's sleeping, but the heart rate's getting lower and lower and lower. So there is a risk there. It's such a harrowing experience. There's no addiction profile. And yet it's in Schedule 1 in the United States. The United States is only like one of 7 countries in the world where Ibogaine is illegal. So I think we're going to just finally realize that Ibogaine is very effective for things like heroin addiction and opiate addiction. Why not use it in the right setting? So coming back to your question, when these are legal, what's the right frequency and setting to do that? I envision Satori centers being opened. Satori being the word for sudden awakening. And essentially a center for awakening where people come to specifically have awakening experiences. And so they might show up with a history of treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, frustration, known or unknown trauma, but that just general dis-ease with life. There is this like something is not right, and I know I can, should, and would love to feel better. And so they come into a center where there's a menu of services, one of which is the psychedelic medicines. And there's a lot of ways that people heal, and a lot of ways that people wake up. And psychedelic medicines are only one of those ways.
Sure.
You can do that through vision quests, or fasting, or experiences with meditation, orgasm, drumming, chanting, flotation. There's a lot of ways that people reach gods.
I had a friend, she said to me, I asked her, have you tried LSD? Have you done this? She said, no, but don't worry. There are many ways to roll down that hill.
Right. That's a very good description. Totally. Or roll up the hill,
Yeah.
Whichever direction we go. So if someone is able to come into a center where there's trained facilitators, there's a safe environment, and they're offered the menu of services, and the people that are on the other side doing the facilitation work have skill in being able to assess where that person's at and their own level of personal development, and what that person might be best served in order to experience, like level 1, level 2, level 3, at what dose, in what kind of context, with what kind of music, with what kind of supported methodology to allow the greatest healing to happen. Then we're getting really freaking sophisticated, because the psychedelic medicines are like any other instrument. I can go and pick up a drum or a flute because I'm drawn to it, and I can start futzing around on it. And given enough time, I'll learn how to play it. And if I learn just through my own process, it'll probably be the most authentic way I know how to play it. But depending on how much I am committed to investing time and energy in using that instrument and my own musical constitution, it might take me a while to reach a mastery level using that instrument. Now, if I have somebody that's going to teach me how to do that, and hopefully teach me what my voice is, not what their voice is. And I'm not trying to just copy them. But if they're facilitating my understanding of how to use that instrument in my own life for my own benefit and potentially for benefit for others, like how to make music for others. So if I'm learning from a master, then I'm going to pick up that instrument exceptionally quicker and likely much better in a relatively efficient time frame than it just left to my own devices. So when we're coming into using any new instrument, and I look at the psychedelic medicines as another instrument and another technology. And when we come into the arena of somebody that knows how to do it well and they facilitate that growth for us, then we're really starting to see the biggest, grandest benefit. And when we offer that broad spectrum to people and they get to make their own choice to engage, and usually at this point in where I'm at in my career, particularly if I'm talking to other psychiatrists or the medical establishment in general, I'm just giving them data. And I'm not trying to sell anything. I just want to give you the data because the data is so freaking good. It speaks for itself so that you have the data and that you can make your best informed choice.
Right. Tell me about the data a little bit.
The data is amazing. I mean, we could spend a long time just talking about the different avenues and arenas that data is coming back onto the forefront. There's a whole psychedelic research renaissance happening right now. Yeah. There was a lot of research in the 50s and 60s, and then everything went to Schedule 1 in the early 70s. So the research kind of got put on shutdown. But then you had people like MAPS and Rick Doblin that were still holding the torch in the 80s and 90s. Rick Strassman doing his DMT research in the late 90s. And now all of a sudden there's just more and more talk about it because it is so good.
Yeah.
Ibogaine is about 60 to 70% effective for helping people get off of heroin.
Wow.
And the standard of care is like 10 to 15%. Those are huge numbers. And that's not in a vacuum. That's not just giving somebody Ibogaine and saying, have a good sober life. That's doing a whole lot of support and recovery coaching and sober living training on the other side. And without that, there's a high relapse rate. But what Ibogaine does is it arrests and reboots the neurochemistry, the addictive neurochemistry, and it resets it kind of back to its baseline. Ayahuasca is great for treatment-resistant depression. Psilocybin is great for smoking cessation as well. It's like 80% effective for helping people stop smoking.
Jeez.
That's like over a 3-month period with multiple sessions of psilocybin and multiple sessions of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So it's not in a vacuum. It's with the right preparation, experience, and integration. MDMA is supremely effective for chronic severe PTSD at like 83% effective.
Wow.
These are just great numbers. But again, it's having the excellent facilitation. And we in the West, we try and get super reductionistic, and we want to make sure out of safety, understood, particularly in the realms of psychedelic medicines, out of safety, it's super important to make sure that you're doing your due diligence and because you don't want to recreate trauma or cause trauma when there wasn't any trauma. That's actually going against the medical credo of first do no harm. And I do think that there's a way to expedite the research and put more funding into the research. And MAPS is helping MDMA get essentially legalized by trained practitioners. It's in phase 3 trials right now. The HEFTA organization is doing the same thing for psilocybin, phase 3 trial level. But most of these are privately funded because the government and the pharmaceutical industry doesn't really have a huge, or at least they don't recognize a huge investment in supporting this kind of research. But when you're looking at just the social consequences of severe chronic PTSD, addiction, treatment-resistant depression, and anxiety, when you look at the consequences on humanity as a whole, everybody, in my opinion, should be motivated to support this kind of research because the medicines are so freaking good.
Right.
And we, right now, you can make the argument that we are in a state of crisis globally. Like, when are we going to wake up and support the medicines that work really well?
Let me ask you this. I really, really love one of the most influential things in my decision to kind of go down the rabbit hole, as you said, I really love that, was this article by Sam Harris, Drugs and the Meaning of Life. And there were a couple really important things that I took away from that. One was, once the gates of hell have been opened, there's kind of no shutting them. But another statement that I really loved was that he mentioned that he has 2 daughters, and if they never experiment with psychedelics, he'll actually feel as if they've missed out on a critical rite of passage. So I wanted to ask you, from a medical perspective, I mean, would you agree? Is this something just about everyone without kind of a history of psychosis should consider experiencing?
Absolutely.
Wow. That's a ringing endorsement.
Absolutely. We are so absent in our recognition of the importance of rites of passage ceremonies for our youth today in our culture. It's a huge missing piece. Mm-hmm. And most adolescents are going to experiment with psychedelics anyway. So ignoring that fact is ludicrous. If most are going to explore anyway, then let's help them do it in a good way. At minimum, it's going to be likely a safer experience than them just exploring on their own.
Right.
And at best, it's going to help facilitate a really transformational experience where they get more clear on who they are, what they're here to do, and what are the next steps to take.
All right. I got a question for you then. We have an audience member, let's say, hypothetical audience member, 21-year-old, has listened to this episode, said, hey, you know what? Dr. Dan's right. I'm going to give this stuff a try. Where does that person start? What words of wisdom would you want to share? What cautions, caveats, disclaimers would you want to give them?
Great question. This is where like the rubber meets the road, right?
Right. Practical tips to overcome the impossible.
Totally. I like that. Is that one of the taglines for the podcast?
It is.
Love that. All right. Yeah. The usual rules no longer apply. Well, first of all, they ideally would be having this kind of conversation in an open framework with the people closest to them, so that there's going to be support before, during, and after the process. My concern is that when people start investigating and exploring on their own, when others around them don't really know, and then potential dangerous things happen, like particularly in the middle of the experience because they haven't prepared well. And maybe they didn't clean out well enough, or they were taking other things on board that were clashing, or they took too much. They didn't have a sitter. That's getting more of the experience when things go wrong, and all of a sudden the wheels come off. And then also on the other side, during integration, because, if you go through an awakening experience and you come back, it's kind of what happens for a lot of people when they go through something like Ibogaine, trying to treat addictions, is that they have an awakening experience, their neurochemistry gets rebooted, and if they go back into their old environment, they're going to have a really hard time because the environment seeing them as they used to be, and they're around all of their old triggers, so they're going to go back into that relapsed lifestyle.
Right.
Or there's going to be trauma or potentially huge interpersonal challenges because there's no longer resonance. They're in a just different arena than the environment that they just left. So then there's a conflict. Ideally, there's a discussion about it. And if that's not possible, because oftentimes the youth of today are in households or social arenas where these medicines aren't appreciated, and they're even stigmatized and judged and ridiculed and seen as the devil. So if that's not possible, then do due diligence. Make sure if you're going to explore that there's absolutely no history of mania or psychosis. Again, these are just no-goes. When all the checks and balances and contraindications have been assessed and it's a safe entry point, then make sure there's a sitter or somebody around that can be supporting the experience. Ideally, it's somebody who has experience in that role. It's held in a ceremonial context. I'm a huge believer of the power of prayer and ceremony to help the healing experience become that more available and potent. And the setting are one in which It's a calm environment. There's not a lot of, you're not like dropping acid for the first time at school or in a mall or at Burning Man.
Yeah.
Unless you're in like deep playa and you're just taking a solo journey with a really safe friend. Great.
Right.
But if you're like, kicking it in a rave scene when there's just so much other information and energy, and oftentimes what happens in the psychedelic state too, you get your doors blasted open. Like that's why Aldous Huxley titled that book, Doorways of Perception. And so when your doors are blasted open, but you're in a really chaotic environment or a particularly really like traumatic environment, then you're potentially going to get traumatized and take all of that negative energy on. So there's a really good book that I'm going to encourage people to read that goes deeper into all of this description by a really awesome guy and colleague, Dr. Jim Fadiman, Fadiman. He also did a podcast with Tim, and it's called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Jim's one of the heavies in the field. He's been around a heck of a long time, since the earliest days. A gem of a guy, has some great freaking stories too. And his book's good. It's well written. I like what he's included there. And that it would be on the to-do reading list of somebody who hasn't yet had a psychedelic experience, is curious, and wants to take the next steps, because it outlines them really well. And so once you've done that due diligence and it's time to have an experience, then the best thing you can do is drop all expectation of what's going to happen. And as absolutely fundamentally as possible, completely trust the experience that you do have.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it's a safe set and setting and everything's kind of been controlled for, trust your own personal experience, because the medicines work individually and specifically for where one is at and what one is most requiring healing right now. And it might look like nothing happened. Trust that too.
Yeah.
And trust that that was the first step, and likely a longer journey of personal exploration.
Yes.
It's not going to happen in just one sit.
Yes.
And then on the other side, do the integration work and get support. And if there's anything that's concerning or challenging, find somebody that knows how to do that spiritual integration work. And there are those teams and counselors available. I was just on a podcast yesterday with this spiritual emergence, a woman that was trained in a spiritual emergence network through Stanislav Grof. Her organization is IMHU, and it's Integrating Mental Health for You, or I think is what it stands for. But anyway, their charge is helping people integrate spiritual awakenings. And another organization is Being True to You, and they have coaches that are specifically trained in supporting people going through psychospiritual journeys and integrating that on the other side. So that's kind of the full spectrum, 3-phase: preparation, experience, and integration. All of them are supremely important.
Absolutely. I can attest to every single word that you've said, and just how important and how thankful I've been that I did my homework and did my research. I wanted to ask one thing that you did leave out. You said, you have your level 1s, level 2s, level 3s. Is there a particular substance that you would recommend as an entry level? It sounds like psilocybin might be that one.
It kind of depends on the indication, what somebody's in the midst of desiring to heal from. If somebody's really locked down emotionally and psychically, I have, friends and colleagues and clients that are supremely excellent with their minds, very focused, very successful entrepreneurial types with their hearts guarded, that you can just get the sense, and they even get the sense it's been a lot of trauma in the past that they haven't really unlocked. Psilocybin might not be the first go.
Okay.
In that context, it might be something like MDMA is the first go, because
yes.
MDMA is really good for that PTSD kind of arena where it de-armors the heart. And it allows more of the feeling body to come online. And that's why historically it's really good and has been used for couples.
Yes.
In couples therapy work, facilitated in that kind of arena. And that's why it's really good for PTSD with war veterans coming back from war-torn areas, or relief workers. Like another friend had an amazing healing happen when she came back as a Red Cross field worker. And she was as traumatized as the people that she was trying to help because there wasn't really much support for the aid workers when they came back.
Right.
And it was just amazing to hear some of her stories and the healing that happened for her. So it kind of depends on where you're at. I've seen a lot of people go through their first entry point in an ayahuasca ceremony after investigating the places to go. For example, one of the centers that I consult with is the Temple of the Way of Light down in Iquitos, Peru, pretty close to where I lived for about a year. And they're doing it really well. They have one of the largest ayahuasca centers in the world, and bigger is always not better. But the way they're doing it is very good. And they've got an incredibly good track record and success rate. They've probably seen close to 6,000 people go through their center, and they've only had a handful of negative outcomes. And that was usually because somebody didn't disclose that they were on a medication or had a psychiatric history of psychosis or mania. So I've seen a lot of people go through massive healing in that arena, and it's because it's ceremony. So at that point, you can go into potential level 2 if you're called to it. It's really important to know who you're sitting with. I wouldn't do Aya at all on your own.
Yeah.
Right. But if if somebody's doing something kind of on their own as a first entry point, then usually something like psilocybin or MDMA are fairly safe.
I think that's super sage advice. Friends have asked me, about LSD, and I've said, look, it's a lot like strapping your mind to a rocket ship, and you better make sure that you have a rocket scientist handy to walk you through if things start, going tits up. I wanted to ask you, it sounds like you're not very concerned about long-term effects on the brain. I mean, is this something that people should be concerned about with repeated use, or it's kind of not really a concern?
We don't know a whole lot, to be honest with you, at this point. Part of that is because a lot of the research that was just coming online got shut down for 30 years.
Yep.
And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that the psychedelics, when used well, and not just like any medicine has its sweet spot.
Sure.
If you don't use enough, you don't get a therapeutic benefit. If you use too much, it becomes poison. That's anything from nature and anything in the pharmaceutical arena, food. You could say the same thing about water.
Bingo.
Everything has its sweet spot. So if you're using it in the right dose, in the right setting, and not too frequently or too heroically, there's good evidence to suggest that there's a significant benefit in the neurochemistry and then in the brain. And that could be for a lot of different reasons. It could be because things like cannabis, ayahuasca, iboga, they all stimulate BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, psilocybin, put in there too, which means they stimulate new neuronal growth. LSD lights up new neuronal patterns and pathways that wouldn't be lit up otherwise. And there's some great neuroimaging research coming out of the Royal College of London with both psilocybin and LSD showing extraordinarily active neural patterns and pathways that would be seen kind of similar in some capacity to the child's brain.
Right.
Which is very growthful, very curious, very online, open to new information, etc. Now, that doesn't mean if you run that kind of frequency every day that that's healthy. You can start blowing circuits and blowing fuses. And running that much energy can be really hot on the neuroreceptors. So, for example, with something like for MDMA, some of the old research suggested that it's really hot on the serotonin receptors. Some of the new research suggests that it's potentially not if you protect it with antioxidants.
Right. Or 5-HTP as well.
And that's typically if somebody's going into MDMA experience, I say, well, mega dose with antioxidants going in to protect the receptors, and then dose with 5-HTP on the other side to recoup the serotonin stores. So if we know how to really set the neurochemistry up for success, then we can see more and more of the benefit with less and less of the side effect or the negative risk.
Right.
This is where a lot of the research is going, and that's why I think it's such an exciting time in the entire arena of psychedelic medicine right now.
Absolutely. And I was just going to say, if people want to reach out, they want to get in touch with you. I know you're doing a lot of really great work at Crossroads. Where would you like us to send people, either to get in touch, to donate to research, stuff like that?
Great question. MAPS is doing great research. Hefter's doing great research. MAPS is primarily for MDMA right now. Hefter's for psilocybin. ICEERS is doing great research. It's an organization out of Spain, ICEERS.org. They're doing great research on both ayahuasca and iboga. As far as Ibogaine experiences, I think Crossroads has the best, safest one that I've seen, at least in North America, if not the Western Hemisphere. As far as ayahuasca centers go, the Temple of the Way of Light, again, I think is just doing amazing work with a lot of women healers. For a while, they only worked with women healers. And now there's a really good mixture of extraordinarily beautiful facilitation down there. Arrowwood is a great area to get just personal research from if people are trying to geek out on this kind of stuff. And that's EROWID.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yep. So those are just a kind of a snippet of
perfect
the next steps where people can get a lot of good information from.
Perfect. And if people want to kind of reach out to you and learn more about your work, where would you like us to send them?
I work with a few different organizations that typically people can contact me through.
Okay.
One is the two that I've mentioned, Crossroads and the Temple. Another is onnitlabs.com, ONNIT.
Mm-hmm.
They're more of a peak performance company. They work with nootropics and supplements as well as peak performance gear. So again, when we're looking at like the whole spectrum, it's good to know like how do we drive our body into the best ways possible, and how do we draw our minds and our hearts into the best ways possible.
Yeah. I use their new mood. Well, another glaring admission, but their new mood is very, very effective after a dose of MDMA.
Yeah, their new mood formula is amazing. It's one of those, if I take new mood, I wake up singing the next morning.
Yeah,
it's just like
me too.
Noticeable.
Me too.
My personal practice that I'm just now rebranding now and launching the website is called Full Spectrum Medicine. And that website will probably be out in the next few weeks.
Awesome. So by the time people hear this, they can check out that link.
Cool.
Awesome.
Great.
Dr. Dan, I want to ask you one last question that we always like to close on, and it is this. Imagine a year from now, 2 years from now, people have forgotten, unfortunately, so much of what we talked about today, but they remember one very, very important lesson. They carry that with them for the rest of their lives. What would you hope for that lesson to be?
Great question. I'll come back to that Viktor Frankl quote. And because for me, it was really supportive for me when I've hit challenging times, because I remember his process and his experience. So I take even more deeply his quote and his offering and message, which is the last of the great human freedoms is our ability to choose our own attitude in any given circumstance. And that's the redemptive power of our own free will choice, and the fact that we get to choose our faith at any given point in our lives, even when it feels like everything is going quote unquote wrong or against us, or we can't figure out why it's happening the way it is. We have choice to reclaim our faith in that experience, and only we can do that. Nobody can do that for us. And hope is the expectation or the desire for it to be different in the future. But faith is the reclamation that I can choose a different relationship with it right now.
Brilliant. Dr. Dan, that's such a wonderful, wonderful note to end on. And I've enjoyed our conversation so much. It sounds like you and I are going to be fast friends. I really want to thank you for your time and for sharing your incredible wisdom with our audience today.
Awesome, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure, man.
All right. You take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
All right, super friends, that's it for this week's episode. We hope you really enjoyed it and learned a ton of applicable stuff that can help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If so, please do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or however you found this podcast. In addition to that, we are always looking for great guest posts on the blog or awesome guests right here on the podcast. So if you know somebody, or you are somebody, or you have thought of somebody who would be a great fit for the show or for our blog, please reach out to us either on Twitter or by email. Our email is info@becomingasuperhuman.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.